My name is Lily Mobley, and this is 3 Steps to Equal Representation. Let's begin by discussing the impacts of television on adolescents. According to the American Academy of Children and Adolescent Psychiatry, teenagers usually spend an average of 9 hours watching TV. This increases their susceptibility to PTSD, anxiety, and depression after long hours viewing television. What adolescents view on television is impactful and influential in their everyday lives. Let's pause quickly to define what adolescent television is. This is a term usually used to describe TV shows that feature characters in their teens or early 20s, and these are usually situational comedies or dramatic series. Historically, we have seen trends of underrepresentation of females in adolescent television. Underrepresentation includes these common instances in which females might be present in these television shows, but are shown in lesser roles than their male counterparts. Brownlow and Durham outlined these gender discrepancies in their recent research paper. They studied popular children's cartoons that spanned multiple decades and measured the characters' use of science and technology within these shows. A character using science and technology, in these cartoons in particularly, would be described as a main character. They found that overall, 77% of the characters that actually used science and technology were male. The female characters were only seen as housemakers, assistants, and wives. We have, however, seen a change in the roles of women portrayed in television throughout the years. Sociologist and media studies scholar Andrea Press outlines these shifts in a chronological order. She begins with early television of the 1950s, in which women were usually confined to the family setting and were only seen in household roles. There was a shift in the 1960s and 70s in which we saw an increase of women in working roles. However, during a post-feminism era of the 80s and 90s, there was a yearning for the past, which undercut the progress made by an increase of women in working roles. Current television, which for Press's analysis would have been the early 2000s, there was an increased representation varied in sexuality, race, and choices. These findings led me to inquire, is there an external force impacting these changes? Press even concluded in her own findings, there's an ebb and flow of female roles in television that relate directly to the external feminist movements. There was a mirroring in the shows of their portrayal of women when compared to the outside forces. Doss noted in their research paper of how, due to its wide-reaching capabilities, television has been used to promote societal concepts for many years. Research shows that female representation is most impacted by feminist movements. The International Women's Development Agency defines feminist movements as a movement of people pursuing a social or political issue that focuses on women's rights. For example, reproductive rights or equal pay. Some prominent examples over the years have been the suffragette movement of the early 20th century, the #MeToo movement, protests surrounding the Roe v. Wade controversy, and the riot girls of the 1990s. This begs the question, does the presence of a feminist movement affect the female representation in television? Which led to my research question. Over the past 50 years, can a correlation between female character representation in adolescent television and the feminist social movements of the United States at the time of the show's airing be found? However, an important aspect to consider when I came up with my research question was how exactly I would measure this. And the answer is the Bechdel Test. The Bechdel Test was created by Alison Bechtel in 1985. It was originally a stab at the patriarchal influence of blockbuster movies at the time, but has been transformed into a reputable, commonly used test to measure female representation. The Bechdel Test is comprised of a 3-part checklist to measure the amount of female representation of a show or movie. So a film or show must meet 3 requirements. There must be 2 named female characters, the characters must speak to one another, and they must speak about something other than a male. Many previous researchers have validated the use of the Bechdel test. Slysker concluded that it, quote, gives insights to ideas of identification or role model criteria that are also common within vernacular feminist criticism. The Bechdel test is directly representative of the real world. It was also used to select films for a study in a college curriculum, and the researchers stated that applying the Bechdel test allows educators to circumvent the pervasive low-grade sexism of popular culture. And lastly, after testing 221 films, Argwal concluded that films that did in fact fail the test portrayed women as less central, less important characters. Based on this outside literature and existing research, I hypothesized first that with the rise in awareness and acceptance of feminist movements, more recent shows should pass the Bechdel test. Hendren supports this hypothesis by stating that recent feminist films portrayed women equally and no different than any other person. Secondly, there will be a correlation between the presence of social movements of a time of the show's airing and the passing of the Bechdel test. This would again indicate an increased representation of female characters. For this research, a mixed method is necessary. First part is a content analysis, and the second is a correlational analysis. The content analysis contains the process of using the Bechdel test on the adolescent television shows. I first identified 5 adolescent television shows, one from each decade to measure the 50-year time gap, and I chose the following shows: Happy Days from the 70s, The Facts of Life from the 80s, Saved by the Bell from the 90s, Wizards of Waverly Place from the 2000s, and Austin and Ally from the 2010s. The next step was to conduct the Bechdel test on these shows. For time's sake and because I lacked the resources to test every episode, the first and last episode of 4 seasons from each of these shows were tested, and each scene within the episode were measured. And lastly is to identify the feminist social movements based on the IWA's definition. This content analysis mirrors that done of Argwal and other researchers that analyzed female representation in the past. However, a gap still exists, 1, in testing adolescent-specific television, and 2, comparing the scores to the movements. My intent is to fill this gap with my research. Here are some statistics for the content analysis. There were a total of 40 episodes tested and a total of 428 scenes. Each episode averaged about 10.7 scenes. And lastly, the show spanned from 1974 to 2016, fully encompassing the 50-year time span. This graph shows the average score for each television series. This average was calculated by taking the score for each episode tested, which is calculated by each scene that did pass the Bechdel test per the total number of scenes in that episode. The episode scores were averaged and are shown above. From this initial data, we can see that the results do mirror one of my initial hypotheses. The more recent shows, The Wizards of Waverly Place and Austin and Ally, had a higher average pass rate. The oldest show, Happy Days, falls well below 0.1, which is shockingly low compared to the rest. Saved by the Bell was also extremely low. However, The Facts of Life, the show representing the 1980s, had a higher score than even the second most recent show. The second graph separates the scores into years. The high average of The Facts of Life is mirrored here with the spikes that occurred in the 1980s. These spikes caught my attention because I was curious to see if they would reveal an influence of the external feminist movements. As you can see from this comparison of the movements to the scores, there does seem to be an influence around the spike that occurred in the previous graph, here in the 1980s and 1990s. However, a clear correlation between the overall movements and scores could not be observed. Taking this into account, I took a couple steps back in my analysis and further analyzed the individual steps of the Bechdel test. As a reminder, these are the 3 steps of the Bechdel test. There must be 2 named female characters, they must speak to each other, and they must speak about something other than a male. With these in mind, I reanalyzed the relationship of the movements, but with each individual step score instead. Similar patterns did occur, as seen in these next 3 graphs. There was still a spike present in 1984, but the score for all 3 remained high after this spike. Yet again, there was no clear correlation between the individual Bechdel step tests. I did observe significant changes in the results of the individual step scores. Some shows would maintain a high score for all 3 steps, while others would drop sharply after the second or third steps. The most significant results were observed in Happy Days, The Facts of Life, and Austin and Ally. This graph of the scores of the step scores by year is extremely telling of the female representation of television shows in the 1960s. While females were present in these episodes, for example here and here, they were rarely seen speaking, and their conversations were almost never about something other than a male. There's a sharp contrast, however, in the results of The Facts of Life. There is such a high female representation due to the fact that the majority of these characters were females. However, as you can see from these dark orange bars, even though the majority of the characters were females, many of their conversations still pertain to males. And lastly, Austin and Ally shows the most somewhat even distribution of step results. This shows that within this series, the females were present. When the females were present, they were represented and had individual conversations. There are some limitations present in my research. One, because of the age of Happy Days, I couldn't access all of the episodes, so I only could watch the first, second, fourth, and fifth seasons. There was a significant time gap between the end of Saved by the Bell and the beginning of Wizards of Waverly Place. But interestingly, there weren't that many feminist movements that occurred in this gap. Third, I could not test every episode because I didn't have the resources to do so, which could have yielded more results. And lastly, there is a limitation in the Bechdel test itself. It's extremely easy for a scene to fail the test, even at the slightest mention of the word he or talking about a male, which is not truly representative of the content of the conversation, which ties into my suggested future directions. There's a need for further inquiry into the aboutness of the conversation of these characters. Because the Bechdel test is limited to a fail, even at the use of a word pertaining to a male, it is not wholly representative of if the conversation centers around a male. For example, many scenes in Austin and Ally failed to pass the test because the females would mention a male, but the content of their conversation actually centered around the female's career progression, making it more equally representative of the female's career as her male counterpart. Further analysis into this content of the conversation will truly demonstrate an influence of a feminist movement as well. The females could discuss ideas pertaining to these prescribed to the external feminist movements. This further research would give more accurate insight into the true relationship between the female representation on television and the presence of an external feminist movement.
How did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
Well, like I previously talked about, I couldn't observe a clear correlation between just looking at the feminist movements and the results of the Bechdel test. So I decided to backtrack a little bit because I saw that by breaking the steps down into individual scores, it was more telling of if a female was actually fully representative. Compared, so for Happy Days, for example, there were females present, but they didn't speak. And then in Austin and Ally, they would speak, but sometimes they would speak about a male. So it was an interesting contrast of the representation.
Second question. How does your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So I think my new understanding is very much a baseline understanding of female representation in this adolescent television, because it does show the progress of the change throughout the years when you look at Happy Days scores compared to Austin and Ally scores. So I think it answers that question in the scholarly conversation. And I think it also shows that the Bechdel test is effective in measuring, again, like that baseline female representation, but for an actual analysis of if there's an external force, there's a deeper method needed.
Think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
So the initial inquiry actually came from the first source that I discussed, Brownlow and Durham's analysis of the children's cartoons, because I was interested in looking at children's picture books. So this process just kind of led me down the rabbit hole of looking at how different genders and then races and also minority groups are represented in what adolescents and children are exposed to. So I think just that process of finding how research relates to one another and then how we can expand on it will relate to future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Oh, that was just good.
All
I can
right,
breathe.
and the floor is open for general questions.
Lily, I'm
Okay.
curious personally how you chose the TV programs that you did. Like, what factors did you take into consideration?
Sure. So I did it. I wanted them to be mostly all of them to be situational comedies. So I said that the episode lengths had to be 20 to 30 minutes. I used the definition that I found of that the main characters have to be mainly teenagers, and said that there had to be at least 3 main characters that were teenagers. And then I also, because that still yielded like a lot of results, so I used the IMDb ratings of viewership to get the most viewed, because that would have been the most wide-reaching television shows.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Jacob? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jake. Okay. Would you consider anything else besides the Bechdel test?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think the Bechdel test is a really good baseline test for anything, because it still does show a lot about the representation. But if I were to add anything, it would probably be kind of like a keyword generator. So if the females were using specific words in their conversations that would indicate an increase of like talking about a feminist movement or talking about their rights, then that would be what else I would add to that.
I want to say that I love this, and that it was really beautifully done.
Oh, thank you.
I just want to, do you think that there might be a time gap from when TV picked up on the movement, or had to like catch up to the movement before it was actually like shown, and could that be part of your not seeing the correlation just because you have a time lag?
I definitely think so, which is why I can go back to it real quick. For these spikes, I was looking at, because at first I thought that and I was like, oh wait, because it does take about 6 months for when the show is written for it to be filmed and produced. So the writing of the show would happen well before it was actually aired on television. So that's why I thought that the feminist movement that occurred in '84 would influence the results of '85. But I definitely think if I could go back, I would be more mindful of like giving that time gap when I'm analyzing it. So yeah.
This is just me.
Yeah, sure.
I grew up on the facts of life. Like Natalie and her
Yeah.
her study hat. When did it start? Do you have that?
It started.
Because it's such a, for those of you in the audience who don't know the facts of life, let me give you just a little. because
79.
The girls were in like this boarding school
Yeah.
kind of thing, and it was all about the education of young
It's
women.
really cool.
Yeah, it's super
Yeah.
cool. So I was kind of thinking about that, just for them to have a show about young women
Right.
pursuing academia was just so beyond, I
Right.
think, at the time. But so it started in '79.
Yeah, which was super interesting because, the results of the first and second steps were so high,
Yeah.
but they still talked about male characters a lot.
Right.
So,
Well, Blair.
right. It's all blue.
I mean, I'm not kidding. I know. Is Bechtel, is she still living? Do you know?
I think so.
I would love to see what she thinks
Yeah.
about how the test used to sort of
Right.
develop.
I found a paper where she was interviewed, and she said that, like, she really didn't intend it to go this way. It's become such a thing. She wrote it in, like, a comic strip in a newspaper,
Wow.
right? So then it was turned into, like, a lot of research papers using it. So I think she said that, like, she sees the use of it, but I don't know, it wasn't her intention, so she
Right.
kind of was like, oh, okay. But, yeah, I'd be interested to look into that, too. Yeah.
Does anybody else?
I've got to know how long it took you to get through 428 scenes.
So long. Because I thought I could skip through a lot, and some I could, like Happy Days, they just weren't there. So I could like skip through a lot of the episodes. But when it got into even just at the Facts of Life, I had to watch everything to make sure that it was not talking about a male, and I missed it. So yeah.
Kudos to you, Lily.
Thank you. I think I just turned it off. How do I turn it back on?